Thanks, Patrick. My name is Paul DeGreef. I'm the manager of Parks Planning and Development here at Saanich, and this strategy is particularly relevant for me because I'll be responsible for implementation when it's adopted by council. So thanks, Patrick, and I will pass it to Julie, who works with me in Parks Planning and Development.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Lammers, and I'm a park planner designer. And I have, I think, probably spoken to a lot of you or had some kind of connection with many people with regard to this process, and kind of working behind the scenes with Lees and Associates and Modus to, work out everything that we need to work out with regard to the strategy. And of course, we'll be helping Paul with the implementation as well, and getting it to council at the end of the month. Thank you.
Eva, I think you've already introduced yourself, but maybe go at it again.
Thanks, Patrick. My name is Eva Riccius. I'm the senior manager at Saanich Parks, and really love working there because every day is different. Thanks.
Megan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Turnock. I'm a principal at Lees and Associates and specializing in parks, recreation, and trails planning and design and engagement as well. And I'm currently the project manager from the consulting team developing this strategy in partnership with Saanich Parks and the community. And over to you, True.
Hi, everyone. My name is Drew Taylor. I am with Modus Planning, Design, and Engagement, same as Patrick. I have been supporting this project with public and stakeholder engagement. I can't believe we're at our final engagement session. It's really exciting that we've come this far, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Great. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. These are your esteemed panelists for the evening. So when we get to the Q&A session, they will be answering your questions as best as they possibly can. So for the agenda tonight, we're going to start off with a little bit of a presentation, provide you with some information as to what the strategy holds, and then we'll dive into the Q&A session. Once the Q&A session is over and we've answered all your questions, we'll then have a few quick points just to touch on closing and next steps with the strategy. So with that, I'm going to now pass it on to Megan to provide us with a lovely presentation. Thank you.
Patrick, I'll share my screen now. So this presentation is a high-level summary of the draft strategy. There's a lot of detail in there. When you dive into the appendices, there's quite a lot of information. So there will be plenty of details that we can either answer by questions, or you can dive into the draft strategy. The full draft strategy is available on the district's website, and we also have an online questionnaire, which is going to be the main way for you to provide feedback on this draft. So just wanted to let you know that. So the presentation covers the project overview. For those of you maybe who haven't been participating yet, we'll go through what we've heard so far. We'll present the draft vision, goals, and principles, and then I'll touch on the key recommendations that have been developed And finally, just touching a bit on implementation and next steps, or where we're going after this session. And then we'll have time for Q&A, as Patrick has said. So the purpose of the strategy, which really started from the beginning of the process, is to provide positive relationships between people, pets, and the environment in Saanich Parks. There's an increasing population in Saanich and across the Capital Regional District. There's an increasing number of pets in parks, as well as people, and more demand on park space. That increasing pressure is on a limited amount of parkland, and so we're trying to find ways to better balance different uses and find ways we can all use parks and respect everybody's use of parks. There are changing needs and demands. The number of dogs in Saanich has increased, as well as the way people are recreating, and especially COVID brought a lot more people out to the parks as well. So things change, and we need to be able to adapt. And then finally, looking at conflicting park uses and environmental impacts and the concerns. The project is 6 phases, and we've been doing iterations between phases 3 and 4, doing engagement to sort of learn more about the issues and the challenges and the values of the community, testing some ideas and some draft vision, coming back to the community, and now we're in the full draft strategy stage. And following this presentation and this last round of engagement, once we have this session, we get feedback through the questionnaire. We'll be finalizing the strategy and bringing it to council for their consideration. So we've done lots of different activities and used different methodologies to do our best to use the best available information we can have, develop and do research to bring new information to the forefront, and especially looking at the way the district currently manages parks and trails and pets in those spaces. We've reviewed all the pet-related policies and bylaws. We've done precedent research, including pet policies, management strategies from other jurisdictions, to try to see, what is the general best practices, what's working and what's not working in other communities. We've done research on managing pets and the environment and what the impacts might be, as well as the benefits of pet ownership and the benefits there. We've also done, since our last open house, we did an in-depth analysis of Saanich's park system. No matter what we want it to be, Saanich has a system that is over 170 parks. Each of those parks is unique. They vary in size, they vary in what the amenities are. So we thought it was important, especially from what we heard early on, to do a really tailored strategy for Saanich itself. Finally, we've done multiple rounds of engagement throughout the process. This is the summary of some of the key elements of our engagement process. In round 1, it was really about information gathering and identifying community values, challenges, opportunities, needs, and concerns, and hearing all the different perspectives, and getting a lay of the land of what the community's values and challenges and really focusing on those as we move forward. In round 2, we presented a draft vision and principles and goals, presented a lot of the background information that we had gathered in the research. We tested about some potential models for managing pets in parks, meant as a conversation starter to see what the primary issues and preferences were in the community. We've had lots of participation. Likewise tonight, it's great to see so many people here. Round 1, we had round 1 and 2, we had over 2,000 participants in both of those rounds of engagement. So we've heard a lot through this process. Through that first and second round, we aim to identify those community values that were most consistent across all the different engagement activities and through our research. Some of you may remember these from the last open house. These themes have remained consistent, frankly, throughout the process, and have been a really important touch point as we develop the recommendations. So people value open space, the importance of having open spaces for dogs to play and get exercise off leash, and that can't be replaced. And then also that having dogs in parks and on and off leash is a huge benefit, health benefit and social benefit to pet owners. It's important to have a variety of parks, parks that are distributed across the district, and also different types of parks with and without dogs, and with different amenities. Some of the amenities we heard were missing, where there was no really fenced areas for dogs that some people felt safe bringing their dog to, or other pets. Safety was definitely a theme. We heard safety is important for both people and pets, both from preventing pets maybe from running into streets, or just respecting everybody using parks and the safety of people in parks as well. In terms of environmental considerations, the community, we heard very strongly that the importance of environmental and wildlife protection was top of mind, as well as having opportunities to connect with and recreate in nature, both pet owners and non-pet owners. There's definitely quite a strong interest in environmental conservation. Park cleanliness and waste management definitely was came up a lot. The community values park cleanliness. Waste management is an important consideration for people and pets. And then the sense of community too. Community values that there are personal connections that could be formed by bringing pets to parks and interacting with other community members. Maybe people who can't own a dog get to enjoy and interact with dogs in parks. And then finally, park equity. So there was agreement that there should be parks where everybody can enjoy them, and consideration can be made for all those different perspectives, people who want to encounter dogs off leash and enjoy that, and people who don't, people who feel safe in that environment, and people who don't as well. Like the values, there were a couple key challenges that came through very strongly across multiple engagement activities, especially in the first round of engagement, and have guided the development of the draft strategy recommendations. Has definitely been brought up many times that one of the top challenges related to pets in parks is owners not having control over their off-leash dogs, or not understanding what under control means, even with dogs that are off leash. Environmental considerations. So we've heard a lot about park users highlighting the importance of environmental and wildlife protection. There are many people who are doing restoration projects in parks, and the importance of protecting those areas that volunteer hours go in and Saanich invests in. Disturbing and chasing wildlife of dogs and impacting to those renaturalized areas in Saanich parks. And with the biodiversity strategy coming up, and the urban forest strategy as well that Saanich is working on, this is a major concern that also mirrors the values in the community and the importance of those areas. Communication and education came out as a major challenge as well. The community indicated that bylaws and restrictions are confusing, they're not well understood, maybe they're not communicated well either. There's a lack of awareness of etiquette related to people and pets in parks, and that should be a main focus of the strategy. And also just increasing demand. I mean, recognizing the current situation in Saanich, there's just more people and pets in a limited park system, and we're trying to find places for everybody to safely exercise and socialize pets, especially in high density areas and some areas of Saanich that are becoming quite dense, and people don't have their own yard and don't have their own private space to bring their dogs outside and exercise the pets. And finally, visitor comfort. So we did hear from some community members who avoid parks in Saanich due to off-leash dogs being present. And that was from people who own dogs and who don't own dogs, citing that some dogs have to be on leash, maybe reactive, maybe not comfortable with dogs running up to them, things like that. So we were trying to sort of, capture all of those different visitor comfort challenges. So the strategy, all this background research and analysis And all the engagement results helped us to develop a vision statement and a set of guiding principles and goals. These were presented during round 2 of engagement through the open house. And then we've updated these based on some of the feedback. Fortunately, there was some conflicting feedback, so it wasn't they haven't changed dramatically, but there were some things that we heard. Feedback on the vision from round 2 included just people wanted to see a better balance of diverse park user needs, more emphasis on environmental protection. We heard better clarity in language and questions about implementation, which really was kind of jumping ahead, but I'll get to that implementation piece because it's an important part of this process. The principles were well supported. The strongest support was for 3 and 4. So planning for pet amenities encourages stewardship and protects environmentally sensitive areas, wildlife, and biodiversity. Just repeating that environmental conservation theme. And number 4, we all contribute to and have a shared responsibility for creating welcoming and inclusive parks. 2 of the other guiding principles, parks are welcoming, inclusive, and accessible for everyone, including pet owners and non-pet owners. And the importance of parks is essential to pets and their owners' health and well-being. We recognize that. The goal that was most well supported was number 3, improving environmental protection, as well as number 1, ensuring park rules, regulations, and bylaws are clear and easily understood. Other goals that we had included improving compliance with pet rules and licensing, and that links to the education piece. Creating a diversity of opportunities in parks for people with pets. So looking at the current state and finding out how we can bring more amenities and new opportunities for people to better serve all kinds of pet owners in the park system. And then also ensuring that there are adequate places in parks for people who don't want to encounter dogs or other pets off leash. So the strategy really pulls together a lot of background research and analysis, and as well as a park by park analysis of the park system on each individual park based on size and context and the amenities there. And we developed a set of recommendations that really are grouped into 2 categories. The first, which I'm going to spend most time on, is the planning, enforcement, education section. This is the one that focuses on the management approach, including bylaw updates, communication, stewardship, and monitoring. And the second category describes what should go into new amenities, particularly leash optional areas for dogs. So following from the desire to improve clarity and communication, these are such key pieces of the strategy. The main recommendation we're bringing forward is to revise the annual bylaw to specify that dogs are welcome in Saanich parks, in almost all parks, but are to be on leash unless otherwise specified. And when off leash, dogs must still be under control. This is just a much clearer message, I think, than the existing bylaw language, and will help better define which areas are suitable and not suitable for dogs to be off leash. The definition of under control that's also in the bylaw is not consistent with the CRD, and we do recognize Saanich as part of a bigger regional context, and improving consistency within that regional context is part of improving clarity and communication. So we brought forward as well that the definition of under control should match the CRD's definition, which means a person in possession of a dog in a park has a clear line of sight to the dog at all times, and the dog immediately returns to the owner when called or signaled. I do recognize that we did hear some concerns from folks that this is maybe a challenging definition, but what we came down to is it just recognizes that good recall is so essential when there's a safety concern for pets or people, and ultimately it will come down to the context, but having this is also much clearer than saying 2 or 3 calls, or making it a bit looser, because when you need to have the dog recalled, it's essential that it just happens as fast as possible. bylaw enforcement as well, I should say that they're expected to continue to take an educational approach. One of the other recommendations we are bringing forward just to improve consistency is to make sure the bylaw aligns with the federal migratory bird sanctuary regulations. This is going to improve clarity. And finally, there are more than just dogs in parks, and the bylaw really should include all pets in parks, not just dogs. There are adventure cats, there are reptiles. I've seen a potbelly pig in a park before. You know, people have diverse interests and diverse pets and are bringing them out to the parks more often. So it should really be more inclusive. We recognize that with this switch in the bylaw, that there need to be enough places for people to exercise their dogs off leash. It's not going to work if we do a complete 180 and there's no places left for people to go. So what we did was, through this process of examining the whole park system, we identified parks and areas within parks, as well as some trails that are suitable for leash optional areas. And some of the things we looked at were the size of the park, the type of park, if it was a conservation area or not, what kinds of amenities were there, playgrounds or sports fields or gardens, things like this, and especially environmental areas, as that was so important to people. What this analysis revealed was that most of the large parks in Saanich either have sports fields or environmental areas. That's just what we're really faced with when you look at Saanich parks. So although our goal was to provide many, large open areas for pets in parks, it was challenging. The long list of parks that we identified actually had 57 parks areas overall, and many of those do have our sports fields, have sports fields in them as well, just to recognize that there is a need for large open areas. And then as well as within those 57 parks overall, 12 locations were identified for permanent fenced leash optional areas. This is the list on the screen you see now. These 12 locations recognizes that many people asked for fenced leash optional areas. It doesn't meet everybody's needs, but with the selection, we're hoping that can start to balance out the park system for you. I should just highlight that Pecals has 1.5 kilometers of trail, which can be done as a loop. And we've also identified a 0.4 hectare leash optional area. And dogs are still welcome throughout the park when they're on leash, as well as these other parks as well. On leash, dogs are still welcome in these parks. And I'll just show you. I know this is too small on the right-hand side to see the long list, but this is in the draft strategy, which you can explore following this information session. And if you have questions about a specific park, we'll do our best to answer it. I won't go through each individual park. I just wanted to highlight that we did try to, show a distribution of designated areas and aiming for multiple options in each neighborhood. 2 natural areas were identified, Pecals and Cuthbert Homes Park. And then also Cordova Bay Beach was identified for leash optional use, as it's very long and large. It has multiple access points. And there is some parking available at some of those access points. And it's also outside the migratory bird sanctuary. So that has been identified for leash optional use year round. Other recommendations under this bylaw and regulations section, we're recommending working with within the regional context of Saanich, improving collaboration and consistency with adjacent jurisdictions, just to improve clarity and reduce confusion. We've had lots of questions of, well, what does everybody else do in the region? And it's really, it's a mix. There's also a recommendation to establish a permit for commercial dog walkers. This provides an opportunity to ensure dog walkers are aware of and agree to following the bylaws. Specific parks may be designated for dog walkers. And the system will also ensure that Saanich can manage this use within the park system, as it has an impact on the natural environment, other park users, operations, and facilities as well. And dog walkers they're a great way to provide information and education to dog owners as well. So it's a good conduit to have those contacts and to keep in touch with commercial dog walkers. Within the education and enforcement recommendations, we just did hear a lot of that enforcement needs to improve. And we're just recommending that the enforcement focus remain on education. It's clear from discussions with the community and staff that only 2 bylaw officers for the amount of parks is not sufficient. Bylaw officers serve a very important function in communicating the regulations to people and providing education on site and when people are actually using the parks, and really is one of the best ways to get information out. So the recommendations include creating educational resources, doing annual licensing blitz. This, again, licensing is a great way to communicate changes in regulations and the bylaw, make sure everybody knows which parks are available for off-leash use. And then we're also recommending improving tracking of enforcement so that information can better inform the management decisions. And finally, exploring options for progressive fines for repeat offenders. We just recognize that many, we've heard from many people, there are just a few, bad apples or bad actors, but really, how do you go about changing bad habits? And this is one option. Again, that's just to explore options for it. It's not defining what those would be, but worth the conversation moving forward. Stewardship is a big part of this process, and just recognizing that Saanich should have the community still involved in this process. It speaks to how you can get involved to ensure the strategy helps reduce conflicts, which is one of the goals, and to make parks welcoming for everybody. There are a few key recommendations, including having a seasonal ambassador on staff to increase education and awareness. This isn't a bylaw officer. This is someone who's just out in the parks to communicate and make sure everybody knows what's allowed and what's not allowed, and how they can help, where they can get information about pets, improve education about licensing, etc. We also want to encourage stewardship groups to form to help make sure that leash optional areas are well managed and maintained. And finally, a simple one, take a bag, leave a bag stations at all parks, and have an adoption program so people can sponsor those. Waste management, safety, and cleanliness of parks is one of the community values, and it came up many times. Can we have more waste bins? Just people need to be able to be picking up dog waste, etc. So there are some recommendations for increasing maintenance, more waste bins, and regularly evaluating the maintenance resources so that the focus is on those parks that need it most, and that Saanich is ready to bump up that level if needed. Now I'm going to get into the leash optional areas and the amenities. So overall, there are 3 typologies for leash optional areas. Although this chart also shows beaches separately, as they have slightly different possible amenities. This chart reflects what we heard as top priorities for what people want in leash optional areas, whether they're fenced or not fenced. Obviously, with the fenced ones, you have to have a few more things included, and if you have a bigger space, that space might be able to accommodate even more opportunities. So open space obviously is important. Waste bins, take a bag, leave a bag stations, seating, so people, it's more accessible for people, and barrier-free access wherever possible. Making sure there's a path, making sure there's a clear entrance and a connection to a path and a parking area or wherever the park entrance is. And then some special amenities that might be able to be added as space allows or as budget allows for those larger leash optional areas that are fenced. Having separate small and shy dog areas can be helpful, so that if there are dogs that are maybe incompatible at those locations. They can be in separate areas, providing water stations where possible, providing natural elements, trees, rocks, logs, things for dogs to enjoy, as well as just having a more natural environment, natural amenities for people as well. Providing pathways and trails and loops as well within areas where possible, because we do recognize the link between people bringing their dogs to parks and their own health and well-being. And maybe there's some fun agility features at some of these locations in the future. Throughout the process, we've been thinking about how monitoring and evaluation can happen. Like I said in the beginning, we're working with the best information available, and you'll never have all the information you might want to have. But developing the monitoring and evaluation program is really the best way to ensure that adjustments can be made as the strategy is implemented. For example, using infrared counters to measure the use of fenced leash optional areas will be important. Might trigger the need for an additional one in the neighborhood, or maybe one's not well used and there's some opportunities to improve it so that it does become more popular. Developing a standard evaluation criteria for sites in terms of condition, the amenities, the use, number of trees or natural elements. And then also developing an online tool so park users can help monitor and evaluate how the implementation is going. I think that's really important as well. And finally, all of these things will feed into a system where Saanich can prioritize issues and work towards solutions. It is a big park system, and this is proposing a more intensive approach to managing pets in parks. So being able to prioritize and work towards solutions is important. That's the high-level summary of the recommendations. And really, once we got through all of those recommendations and had conversations with staff, it was evident that this was going to require a lot more effort as well as capital dollars to implement. Some of the things that were identified right off the bat, Pets and Parks Coordinator, which would be a 3-year term position, really helped to get things rolling. They could coordinate a lot of the implementation of some of these recommendations and make sure things move forward in the best way possible. Lumping up maintenance staff can't really increase waste pickup or add waste bins without at the same time increasing the number of staff devoted to that. As well, recognizing that many of the parks that we've identified for off-leash areas are sports fields, and in order to make sure those are safe and don't impact the level of play, more maintenance staff is required for that. We have bumped up and recommended more enforcement staff. Again, they're a great conduit. And in terms of education, not just enforcement, but being that ambassador on site and the seasonal ambassador, as I had mentioned during the summer. And over the course of the next 5 years, when we add it all up, fencing is a huge cost. Fencing for either the 12 fenced areas or protecting natural areas that may be in parks where we have designated some off-leash areas without fences. Maybe there's partial fencing. So all in all, most of the capital costs would be going towards new fenced leash optional areas or fences and amenities associated with those for the next 5 years. As I mentioned at the beginning, the draft strategy is available online as well as a feedback opportunity, questionnaire to better understand which of these recommendations you think will be most effective in addressing some of the values and challenges in the community. We're compiling and answering as many questions as we can tonight. There may be some we don't answer tonight, or we run out of time, or we don't have the answers. And we'll try to follow up and post those on Saanich's website as well in the FAQs. And after this, we're going to be making edits. It's not a final draft. It's not a final strategy. So love to hear your feedback we'll be summarizing the engagement results and moving forward in developing that final strategy. And that's going to be going towards the council to get their input and feedback and make any final tweaks before we finalize the strategy. Thanks so much. I know that was a bit of an earful from my end, but we'll move into the question and answer period now.
Thank you so much, Megan. So yeah, moving into the Q&A session. So just a quick reminder that you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and it should open up a little box where you can ask questions. We are going to go through the questions as best we can, and our panelists will be answering them. If you'd like to pose a question anonymously, there is a button that you can check in the Q&A box to ensure that your question stays anonymous. And so there was a question just about the numbers of folks who have attended. We don't actually know this exact number at this point. So, so actually it's about 200 registrants who have registered for tonight's session. And once the session is over, we'll actually know whether or not, or how many people have actually attended, because some folks might be popping in and popping out. So the number is kind of shifting here and there. All right, so maybe moving into one of the first few questions here, there seems to be a little bit of a few questions related to the loop, the 1.5 kilometer loop in Pacoles. A few questions just wanting perhaps a little bit of clarity around what is going to be off leash or on leash, or leash optional within Mount Doug Park. So I'm going to pass that on. Maybe Megan, you can add, have a little bit of a clarity to that particular situation on Pacoles.
Sure, I'm just actually going to pull up the map from the strategy, and that might help. Just trying to pull it up here. And I'll share my screen again. So this is the area that was identified for a fenced area. So that's more of an area. It's a site of a converted gravel pit. So it's very low environmental value there. Most of this park is very high environmental value because of the context of the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone, and many species at risk within this park and within the region. There is this 1.5 kilometer loop here that has been identified for off leash. And again, dogs are welcome throughout the park when they are on leash. So we're hoping between the two of these, we know it's an impact to current uses, but just with all the evidence of impacts and dogs running into the natural areas, it seemed like the best approach. And we'll be determining, it hasn't been determined what the fencing will be like along this, but presumably there will be the need for some fencing to keep dogs from running into some of the natural areas.
Thanks for that, Megan. I think there's another really interesting question here around jurisdictional scans. So I know in the background research, we did do a little bit of review of other jurisdictions and their approaches to this. So yeah, what other municipalities did we look at, and what kind of strategies perhaps did we find inspiration from?
Yeah, I mean, looking at best practices and what other jurisdictions are doing definitely helped us understand what the commonalities were. And we looked at, overall, there were, I think, 8 different jurisdictions, including Saanich, that we looked at in detail. The CRD, Nanaimo, Victoria, Vancouver as more local examples, as well as Edmonton, Seattle, and San Francisco as other communities who have done strategies and who have taken a certain approach to managing pets in parks. Some of the commonalities, they all have, say, dogs must be licensed, dog waste must be picked up. Of course, there are, commonalities, also restrictions on aggressive dogs. No dogs in sensitive ecological areas, almost across the board. Saanich being the exception, and that only some areas have restrictions. Dogs must be under control at all times, of course, those commonalities, and excluding dogs from play areas. 6 out of the 7 jurisdictions that we researched as well had regulations about dogs not harassing wildlife and other animals. So these are some of there were a lot of commonalities that we found through that process. And as well, I think one of the other common themes, and from research on Vancouver's approach as well, is that time restrictions are challenging, and the more complicated the restrictions are, either they're time or seasonal, the more challenging it gets, because people develop their habits, and that dog walkers and people who own pets, they take their dogs out rain or shine year round. And if there's time restrictions or time of year restrictions, that gets very complicated. So we try to avoid the complexity there as well.
Great, thanks for that information, Megan. Moving on to the next question here, really interesting idea here to perhaps have private off-leash facilities in Saanich that would be run and operated much like a private landowner. This has been done apparently in Sooke, and people from all over the Southern Island have come to this facility. I imagine this is a bit of a zoning challenge, but I'll maybe pass that to one of our parks planners to maybe comment on that. Anybody want to take that one on?
I have heard of the person in Sooke who's doing that, but of course, we haven't looked at that in particular in this particular strategy, but it would come down to having a private owner, having, the business license to be able to accommodate such a facility. I do know that there are a number of kennel type organizations in Saanich that have daycare, outdoor daycare kind of operations. So they do exist in Saanich, but I don't know if it's for dog walking. I think it's more where you drop your dog off in the morning and you pick it up in the day, and it's kind of an outdoor run situation. So I imagine if there's somebody who has the land and has the interest in running such a facility, they could, work with Saanich in terms of getting a license to do something like that.
Thanks, Julie. So perhaps something, if there is someone interested to set up that kind of facility, to maybe go to City Hall and or the District Hall and have a little bit of a conversation with staff. So looking at the next question here. So there's a question specifically about Knockin Hill. It's not named or mentioned. Can you speak to that maybe, Megan?
Yeah, I was just reading that as well. It's not on the list for off-leash, leash optional area. So that's maybe why it's not in the presentation. It is in our more detailed analysis of the park system. And my understanding is it's Garry Oak habitat, and also restoration has been happening in that park. And so we've determined at this time it's not appropriate for a leash optional use. Julie or Paul, you want to add anything, but it's my understanding.
Great. All right, so moving to the next question here, there's one about potentially kind of combining the bylaw officer's role with an ambassador's role. So kind of keeping that that role, or merging those roles, and essentially ensuring the bylaw officers are kind of interacting with dog walkers or dog owners in a way that would be in a more positive way, perhaps, free to enjoy the community, but police step in when bad behavior occurs. So this idea of merging those two roles into one. Anybody want to maybe respond a little bit to that?
I think one of the challenges is the park system is so vast that even though we've added and at quite an expense up to 4 bylaw officers who would just be doing patrols in Saanich, it would still be challenging to really meet the demand, even to just be an ambassador in the system. By having clear rules and having clear areas for leash optional uses, we're hoping that reduces both the demand on enforcement, and we are definitely promoting still that the CRD and bylaw officers do take an educational approach. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it sounds like there's an opportunity to kind of increase the capacity and have folks who are part of the community kind of play a role as well. All right. So the next question, has there been any kind of consideration to maintain the lifestyle people really currently enjoy, rather than restricting perhaps this idea of more development and more population growth, you know, that the impacts of population growth and development have on our community, and how can we essentially bridge the gap between that and while still enjoying that lifestyle that people so cherish in the district of Saanich?
It's a good question. The rate of development and population growth is sort of out of our scope and we were tasked to come up with strategies given that that's the case and that growth is happening. And I think we were trying to enable people to continue to have healthy lifestyles and to have as many parks as possible that made sense and had adequate space, and minimizing conflicting uses available for people to bring their dogs off leash. But we also heard from many people who have to keep their dogs on leash all the time too, and need those spaces as well as people who would rather not have dogs off leash in the parks that they're going to. So we're making space for those folks as well to have healthy lifestyles in the park system.
Thanks for that, Megan. I want to move on maybe to maybe a bit more of a technical question here that speaks a little bit to how we decide around the size and the location of fenced off-leash areas. So what's the rationale behind those decision-making, behind the decision-making, I should say?
Yeah, maybe Julie could chime in here too, but we were looking for parks that were large enough so that if we had a fenced area, there was still adequate space in the park for other people to use the park, that it didn't just become all an off-leash, fenced off-leash area. There needs to be a balance, I think, of uses in almost all of Saanich Park. So that was one of the things we were looking for. You know, no environmentally sensitive areas, or enough park space that didn't have those areas that we could do a big enough fenced off-leash area. I think through Saanich's pop-up parks, they did hear feedback that some of those were not big enough. So we were trying to find the biggest spaces we could that made sense. So that was some of the process that went into that. And we're happy to hear feedback too about those locations and yeah, whether there's maybe more opportunities. Julie, did you want to chime in? You don't have to, but.
No, I think you're right on with all of that information, and also exactly where some of the successful pop-up dog parks were, where people seem to sort of really enjoy those. Even though some of those parks will be leash optional, people have reached out to us and said that they appreciate having those spaces, particularly if their dogs aren't good with recall.
Yeah, and I think that really stems well with one of the comments that we're seeing here around hoping that the off-leash and leash optional areas are large enough to allow dogs to fully exercise, because with 2 border collies, that sometimes requires a little bit of a larger area. Great. So I guess there's a question maybe about process here that we can go to next. And so how is the information that's going to support the decisions made by council being developed? So can we speak a little bit to process and how we're including all the various streams of input into the strategy? And will the strategy be revised, and are there going to be corrections made to it? How do we go about ensuring that the final strategy is really reflective of all the input we've received?
Yeah, it is a complex project, many layers of community engagement, from stakeholder sessions to open houses, online feedback forums, a phone survey, as well as the research and analysis of the park system and other jurisdictions and the complexity of the regional context. So all of these things have to be woven together. No one source of information, I think, stood out and was the one piece of information we were using. We did our best to weave those in, and also to consider maybe what we heard the most, but also consider maybe some of the minority views as well, and making sure that parks are welcoming and inclusive of everybody, because there were some comments in the first questionnaire in particular about people avoiding some parks because of the number of off-leash dogs. So just want to recognize that, and may not be the majority view, but making sure that there are spaces for everyone is important. In terms of information, we have tried to distill down the draft strategy to the core findings and clear recommendations and implementation. And all of the information we've gathered so far is provided in appendices. So there's a couple hundred pages, I think, of appendices of information there. Yeah, so that's all being provided.
Thanks for that, Megan. I think the next question we can move on to is maybe something for Paul or Julie, really around how we're going to fund this, right? So are there any thoughts on how the district can fund those capital and staff expenses that are going to be associated with the recommendations of this strategy?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We would be putting this to council as in the future as capital requests, and it all depends on how aggressively we choose to implement and pursue. I would also add that this is one of many strategies that Saanich Parks is implementing. For those of you that have been to Playfair or McMinn Park recently, you will have seen two beautiful new prefabricated washroom buildings dropped into place by a big crane. We have an older adult strategy. We have a youth strategy. We've got a number of different strategies that we implement, all of which have budgets associated with them. This is no different. And while the numbers look sizable, this is part of our role as stewards of a park system. We do have capital budgets, and we have staff and resources that implement, and that's our role.
Awesome, thanks for that, Paul. Moving to a question around the beach areas that don't necessarily have concerns around migratory bird habitat. Can we get a little bit more clarity around those beaches and how they're going to be treated as a result of the strategy?
Right now, there's just the Cordova Beach that has been identified for leash optional uses. It's quite a long area, stretch of beach. A lot of the beaches within Saanich, they may not have parking, for example, and we're hesitant to maybe draw a bunch of dog owners or people who would be driving to one location if there's no parking available, or if there's a very small area. We are trying to find a place where that use could be accommodated. If there's a question about specific beach, we could try answer it. Maybe Julie might be able to answer it, or we could take that offline and tell you more.
Awesome. Thanks for
Maybe
that.
I'll defer to
Yeah.
Paul for that.
I have to apologize. I just missed that.
Just the other beaches that aren't, other than Cordova Bay Beach, that aren't in the migratory bird sanctuary was, I guess, the question about clarifying those.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess looking to the consultants to drive this conversation really about where to at least provide some amenity for the community, some access, but at the same time protect where we need to, and again try and find that balance. So it's a recommendation that I would say, I think in fairness, surprised us a little bit, but acknowledging that we do need to provide some access for off-leash use.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So let's maybe go to a few questions. There's over 70 questions. We've already answered about 20, so I'm moving through these quite quickly, but I hope folks are getting the answers that they're hoping for. I want to maybe move into engagement a little bit. And so we have a question around, we've identified dog walkers as a stakeholder to engage with over the course of this process, but what about dog trainers who utilize our parks for training? And True, maybe I can go to you on this one.
Sure. This is a great question. I'm glad this was brought up. We hosted 3 stakeholder workshops in between phase round 1 and 2 of engagement. And this was really meant to kind of ground truth and refine the key recommendations before going into our second round of public engagement. So with those groups of stakeholders, there were intergovernmental groups, environmental and stewardship groups, and dog owner interest and advocacy groups, which included trainers and professional dog walkers and commercial dog walkers as well. So this was a really great and pivotal time for us to refine those key directions with kind of more of the technical lens of experience in the commercial dog walking world.
Excellent. Thanks for that added context, True. And then I think there's a few questions that we're seeing around waste management in parks, specifically if the district's going to be providing waste bags or invest in more trash cans and pickup services to deal with that waste. And so I wonder if maybe, Megan, is that for you maybe?
Yeah, sure. The district did for a time provide waste bags, but it was just not a great solution. So we have the take a bag, leave a bag recommendations. So that will be added up at all the parks, especially those leash optional areas. And there is additional staff there's an additional waste management truck coming for the Parks Department and staff to manage that. So there will be additional waste management pickups as well. In a couple of years, it's anticipated another truck and crew will be required for the park to serve the whole park system. So that's looking forward as well. We have recommended that to make sure that there are enough waste bins at these locations, particularly the leash optional locations where we know there will be maybe more use than other places. Doing our best to manage, balance adding more waste bins, but also considering that it does take staff to service those.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer, Megan. I'd like to maybe now move to a question about a specific park. So Kings Park. It seems as though it's included as a leash optional area, while it has some important wildlife habitat in that particular area, specifically the fresh water. So can you clarify if there's going to be a designated fenced area to protect that wildlife and habitat within Kings Park? And
Kings
Paul,
Park isn't identified for full fencing, but there is maybe a possibility that that park might need some partial fencing. And just want to emphasize, we're not identifying entire parks necessarily as leash optional, but identifying parks where a specific area of the park would be designated. It may or may not be the whole park. So that's maybe the next step of diving the next detail down into specific park locations.
excellent. Paul, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment a little bit on Kings. June 5th, a community engagement summary report will be going to council. So if there's people interested in Kings specifically online, do look for the June 5th council meeting as an opportunity to hear about the engagement summary report. And currently, what we heard from the community in that particular park is that very much the status quo was desired at this point, with and then I working with the community on developing a more detailed plan as we move forward. So there may be opportunity to look at that issue in more detail as we move forward with the community. But for now, it was the message we received from the community loud and clear was that status quo was desired.
Thanks for that, Paul. A good question here about the bylaw definition of under control. So I know we tried to align with the CRD's definition. Here it says, so that would be with immediate recall, but would we consider what some other municipalities are calling for, which is a return within 3 calls? So I'll maybe see if any of our panelists would like to answer that question.
I mean, I can just answer why we are recommending one, like immediate recall, and that is one, consistency with the CRD, which I think simplifies things for people. There's one rule and we can be as consistent as possible within the region, that's a good thing. The other main reason is many jurisdictions do have the same immediate recall rule, and it's really important if your dog is running towards a person or another dog who may be reactive, or for some reason, going astray into places that shouldn't be, that recall is really good for safety of people and dogs. So I think there'll always be a bit of a judgment call by bylaw officers or others, but it's just really to ensure safety of people and pets, as well as clarity for everybody.
Right. So I'm seeing another question here, sort of around the balance of striking a balance between accessibility to some of these park areas, these leash optional areas, and fitting the needs of those who perhaps who have mobility challenges and need some more accessible spaces in parks. And so having to travel long distances to find off-leash areas can be quite difficult. And so really thinking about how we're integrating accessibility into this strategy. Do we have anyone who wants to talk to that?
We're aiming to have the leash optional areas be as accessible as possible, but it's a good point. Like maybe there could be some allowances for people who have trouble with their dogs on leash, or I mean that's certainly a possibility. We haven't explored that. I don't have any evidence of that being implemented, or its success or not success. It does, but it definitely is something we would hope to aim for if there are challenges there for people.
Right. Thanks for that. And I think that's a key note to make here is that while, you know, these are just questions, they're also kind of comments. And so we can actually take some of these suggestions and some of these comments and use that toward refining the strategy as we go along here. So, you know, there's a couple questions here around what's the threshold, the number that warrants action. So the amount of people, the amount of complaints that comes through the system. When do we decide to essentially shift towards action? And I think part of the answer to this question is that we work with stakeholder groups and we try to, there really isn't a threshold, there isn't a specific number, but we work with stakeholder groups, community residents, and we try to identify certain patterns and see, you know, what we're hearing and see if there's evidence to what we're hearing. So maybe I'll pass it on to one of our staff members at the district here to talk a little bit about that, about when, you know, a certain amount of comments or concerns or complaints occur, when we can start to maybe, warrant action on those complaints.
Yeah, I'll make a comment here. Like Megan, I'm a licensed landscape architect and has spent many years working on design problems and park strategies and managing people. And you know, sometimes I envy engineers and architects that work on problems that have very discrete solutions, or maybe fewer criteria that are used in the evaluation process or the decision-making process. These kinds of problems where there's you know, a long history of use in a space, people get very comfortable using parks in a certain way. I actually, as a UVic student, used to ride my mountain bike in Mount Doug Park, and mountain bikes in 1995 were removed from the park. And I remember getting chased out of the park by other residents. And you're not allowed to ride in here anymore. And I think those kinds of changes are very difficult, but you know, it's not just one criteria that's used to make a decision like that, a people management decision, and in this case, not just people, but also pets that we love. It comes down to a whole range of different criteria that are used to base decisions on. So yes, it might be that we consider the level of complaints that are generated in a specific park, but it's going to include other criteria like cost, like the practicality of managing certain spaces, how much resource needs to go into providing specific services. Another quick example, we have one garbage truck in parks that is run 24/7, well, not 24/7, it's run 7 days a week. It's completely overtaxed. We've had a garbage truck on order for several years now. It's hard to get them. So those are kind of more practical or logistical operational constraints that go into managing a park system and building out and developing a park system. So again, all of those things, there's all kinds of different evaluation criteria that go into the decision making. And I will add, it's also not just survey results or feedback results that we've received from the community that's driving this process. It can't be. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I'll just maybe go over to Eva, who would like to say a few words as well.
Thanks, Patrick. I just would also draw everyone's attention to, I think it was through the first round of engagement where seven a set of 6 values and 7 or 5 challenges. I don't know why I keep thinking 7 were identified, and that's really what is driving a lot of this this strategy. So if we go back to why are we doing this, it's at the common values that we have, the challenges that were identified. We created a common vision and a good set of goals. And so now what the next step is that Megan has outlined tonight is, how do we turn those goals and vision and goals into strategic actions? So that's I'd like to just make sure we are kind of keep that top of mind as well.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Eva. So I believe there's a question here, particularly about Cuthbert Homes Park and sort of, I guess the idea of migratory bird sanctuaries, the definition within the Government of Canada website that waters below the high water mark in Portage Inlet, the Gorge Waterway. So the idea that Cuthbert Homes Park is above the high water mark is not actually a part of that migratory bird sanctuary. So very technical question here. I'm not sure if maybe someone can answer or add a little bit of context to that comment.
I'd have to go back and look at the definition of the Victoria Migratory Bird Sanctuary. I know that the Esquimalt Lagoon Migratory Bird Sanctuary has a 100-meter buffer around the backshore, so it extends well upland. But that's I can't say for sure whether that applies to the Victoria Migratory Bird Sanctuary. So that's something that we could research and respond to.
Great. And maybe that's a good point here to say that, even if we don't get to all the questions, we'll certainly be looking at all the questions that were asked. And I believe we'll be doing our best to then, if you have answered or if you haven't provided a question anonymously, we might be able to connect with you later on and give you an answer to that question, or post some of these answers as well in an FAQ online afterwards as well. I think another question here, just there's still quite a few questions around that 1.5 kilometer loop in Pacoles. So maybe we can answer that those questions again here, just in case some folks tuned in a little later. So really thinking about how that 1.5 kilometer loop was chosen, and the distinction between that space versus other protected spaces that wouldn't be leash optional. Can we respond to that a little bit?
Sorry, Patrick, can you just repeat? Was that just for the calls?
Just how the
Sorry.
1.5 kilometer loop was chosen, and kind of just the decision-making process between what in Pacoles was either on leash or leash optional.
Yeah, the question was really like, what are the most sensitive areas in the park? Where could we find a loop? And Julie, maybe you could speak as well to that 1.5 kilometer, what the trail name is, I think was also a question in Pacoles.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit here.
Yeah.
It's the Glendenning section. And, I think all of us are very, very aware of the extensive stewardship work that has been done in that section of the park. We actually were really impressed with some information that Megan brought forward on Pacific Spirit Park in Vancouver, where they have sensitive ecosystem areas that they have fenced the trail. And it creates an opportunity to be in a forested setting, to walk with an off-leash dog, and in a beautiful park setting, not unlike the Glendenning area of Pacoles. The other thing that's kind of interesting about Pacoles in that section of the park is the soil is very free draining in that portion of the park. So One of the challenges with high traffic off-leash dog facilities is they often get very muddy, or for those that have seen Dallas Road, if you try and do things like put wood chips down, they can get quite smelly. The urine's absorbed by the wood chips. So there can be some challenges that come as a result of having to deal with drainage and muddy surfaces. And that's not expected to happen in this part of Pacoles. So there's some kind of practical advantages to using this site, notwithstanding the cost of having to fence the trail side.
Awesome. Thanks for that added context, Paul. Really important. Talk through some of those details for Pacoles. I want to maybe move over now to a question around maybe not necessarily just parks, but across the entire district. Has there been any kind of discussion regarding making that on-leash default municipal-wide and not just in park spaces? Because it's not unusual to necessarily see dogs off leash in neighborhoods or on roads and sidewalks and so on. Any thoughts on that?
The project was really focused on parks in particular. So that was the focus of this project in particular. Do definitely recognize that dogs must, I think in the bylaw, must be under control and not allowed to roam at large, other than private property, I believe. But I don't know if you want to follow up, Julie or Paul, on that one. Good.
All right. Maybe moving now into perhaps speaking a little bit to the evidence or the research that's gone into how certain pets might be responsible for environmental degradation. And so, yeah, can maybe Megan, your team has done quite a bit of research on this. Could you speak a little bit to that relationship between pets and some of these, perhaps endangered ecosystems or rare ecosystems?
Yeah, some of the impacts that we found through our research, it's hard to find like specific studies on a Saanich Park in particular and to have very detailed data on a Saanich Park in particular, but there have been many studies on the relationship between dogs and wildlife, and of course, that they do have an impact on wildlife, and any disturbance of wildlife impacts that wildlife's ability to find food and shelter, and in terms of migratory birds, just disturbing their much needed rest in these pit stop areas where they're trying to recover from their long flights and migration. I think there's a substantial section in the appendices of the report that goes into detail on those studies, as well as just a summary of some of the high level details. It's not to say that people don't also have an impact on those areas. Recognize that can be an impact too if people go off trail and use those areas inappropriately. But really our focus was on the impact of pets and how they interact with those locations. Hope that is a high level answer, I know, but.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into this other question, which is around the considerations or nuances of these restrictions. So was there any kind of consideration to the time of day or the day of week or even seasonal restrictions in terms of those interactions?
I think given the current state and what we heard already from the community is the lack of clarity on the bylaw, the rules, the complexity of the rules in the parks. So we tried our best to we just did not want to go into complicated requirements. It's not to say that couldn't happen, but our recommendation was to just keep it as simple and straightforward as possible, in the hope that sort of unifies the community in an understanding of the way forward.
Great. Thanks for that, Megan. What do we know about the tendency of fenced areas to create dog fights because of potential dog behavior that may become aggressive or defensive with one another? Is there any evidence at all, or did we find anything in our research around that?
I did not see any research on increased dog fights or interactions. We did hear from people who have reactive dogs who have to have them on leash and still need to use the parks, that it is challenging when many other dogs are off leash and they come up and approach. So that was, we did hear that. I know from having a dog myself that does not like other dogs, I don't use fenced dog parks, and that's a limitation that I'm, that some people have to live with and work around too. Hoping that doesn't happen. I think that can happen in unfenced areas with dogs who don't get along just as easily as fenced areas. But again, I don't think there's a definitive research study on that I know of.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that. A pretty straightforward question here, just around will commercial dog walkers be allowed to walk dogs off leash in natural park areas? I suspect that the restrictions are for everyone, but just wanting a little bit of clarity there.
Yeah, restrictions are for everybody. The same rules apply, and there may be considerations as well if there are many, like the amount of use, like we said, monitoring and evaluation of these areas is going to be ongoing, and to make sure that they don't that they are well maintained and still usable for other park users as well.
Awesome. So maybe moving into the next question here around waste bags. I'm seeing that, a lot of stores apparently aren't providing plastic bags anymore that are particularly adapted for pet waste or are non-biodegradable. Are we seeing, what kind of bags are we seeing people putting in the bag stations? And perhaps we have suggestions for places to get waste bags. I don't know. Is that something that one of the panelists would like to take on here?
The idea was just that maybe if a veterinarian or a dog walking service might want to sponsor and purchase dog waste specific bags, they could provide them. Or if people from the community want to donate some appropriate dog waste bags at those take a bag, leave a bag stations, that would be available. That answers the question.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And so maybe now moving into a question that is really about so this interaction between pets and wildlife, but also seeing people kind of interacting perhaps poorly with wildlife as well. So examples of children chasing birds as an example. And are there ways for folks to perhaps speak to a bylaw officer or register some form of complaint when it's people who are harming wildlife in these kinds of sensitive ecosystems? Sometimes we don't feel comfortable approaching someone in a park to say it ourselves. Is there something there that we can do otherwise?
I think this strategy was definitely focused on pets and how we're managing pets in parks, but there is a recommendation in the strategy about the park management bylaw and making sure that anything that applies to disturbing wildlife actually applies to people as well. Because I agree, this is not just, dogs aren't the only ones. If somebody let their cat off leash in a park, same thing would apply. It really should be, people shouldn't be doing that either. So that actually was in the strategy.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification. And I just want to note at this point in time that we have reached 7:30 p.m. We still have about 88 questions left in our box here that we're seeing. So there's quite a few to keep going through. But if you feel like your question has been answered, you're definitely free to go. If you want to continue, I think we'll keep answering the questions here as best as we can through all of the ones that we have open here. And so just moving forward, I see there's a question here around, again, if a park has been designated a fenced area or for leash optional, then is the rest of that park leash required? So essentially saying that 12 parks are now leash required, except for perhaps within that area that is fenced for leash optional.
That's correct. That those fenced areas were identified within those parks as the appropriate location, and the rest of the park would be on leash. I guess it's possible there would be a unfenced leash optional area, but I think just because of the limited park areas that we're working with, that we probably wouldn't have both of those situations in the same park. Although I guess Falls is one of the exceptions that has a fence leash optional area as well as a leash optional trail.
Great. And so really interesting question about, is consideration being given to regulating leash length? And so, yeah, concern perhaps that one way to keep a dog or keep a pet on leash could be by having a very long length of a leash. So has any consideration been given to leash length?
I think the only leash length is concerning aggressive dogs. Some jurisdictions have specific rules about leash length there, but we did not include any leash length requirements or recommendations here. I think there are some places like on trails in calls, for example, you might want a longer leash because of the terrain. And I think that's an option for folks. Basically, there'll be limitations to what's practical to use in those cases. But
Right. Thanks for that. And maybe just, I see a few questions here again about Knockin Park. So I just want to maybe get a little bit more clarity around this. So part of Knockin Park is within View Royal. So how would that work between the different jurisdictions? And also just thinking about, does it mean that any park that's not on the map will not have an opportunity for, off-leash dogs?
I'll answer the second question first, Patrick, that there are 57 parks identified for leash optional, and all the others will be leash required at all times. I'm maybe Julie could answer that specific park question.
Yeah, being that it's
About strategy
Yeah,
with View
Eva,
Royal.
if I'm not mistaken, Eva, we're responsible for the whole management of Knockin Hill Park. Is that not correct?
No, you're
Eva?
thinking of Portage
No.
Park, where we
Oh, okay.
we contribute to View Royal, and they look after all of Portage Park.
Okay.
Yeah, Knockin has a boundary in it.
Okay. Yeah.
so maybe
Then we will have to clarify that.
something to look at and to explore how that might be impacted in terms of this strategy. So thanks for flagging that for us. I think another interesting question here around, will people without dogs still be welcome in those off-leash areas? I think in certain cases, folks who don't have dogs still want to experience some of those spaces. And so will they be told that they have to put up with all the dog behavior, or will they will there still be expectations around good behavior in those spaces? What is the interplay between those types of interactions?
Yeah, I think one of the decisions to not have all the leash optional areas fenced is just because there should be, didn't want to fence off and block other uses as well. So we fully expect people without dogs to be using many of those areas. I suppose you could even visit some of the fenced leash optional areas if you wanted to meet some dogs. I'll just be clear, like just because you're in a fenced off leash optional area or an unfenced leash optional area does not mean there are no rules. Dogs must still be under control at all times, leash or no leash, no matter where you are in the park system. Full stop.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Thanks for that, Megan. Maybe you can also shine a bit of light on the selection process for fenced areas. So why were certain parks selected as fenced, such as Larratt's Park, and others maybe not?
Some of them are places where there were pop-up fenced areas that were successful. We looked for places across the district, so location in different neighborhoods. Like I said, the park analysis did go through size of the park, what kinds of amenities were in the park, whether we could do a fenced area or not. We didn't want to fence the whole park or block other uses if the park was fairly small. We were looking for bigger size of parks. Where the environmentally sensitive areas were, if there were any, or if we could avoid them by fencing areas, then that played a role. And again, this is based on fairly detailed analysis, but there's always options for adding or subtracting from that mix. I know a lot of staff have intimate knowledge of all the parks in the system and did a very thorough review too of what made sense operationally from that standpoint. There's another layer of design as well for exactly where the fences go and how big the sizes of these parks are. And that all is a future implementation step to fit it to specific parks.
Moving on, I'm seeing a question here around Cordova Bay Beach. The report mentions it, or it looks as though Cordova Beach might be the only off-leash beach. Is that accurate? If we can also provide a little bit more information on why Cordova Beach as being the only one.
Yeah, many of the beaches in Saanich have limited access. Like there's no parking lot necessarily. It might be just a beach access right of way. Or they're in the migratory bird sanctuary, or just in terms of feasibility, those were eliminated, but this Cordova Bay has several access points. It's quite a long beach as well. Lots of space. I think especially compared to many communities, it's quite a large amount of beach space for leash optional. Any other comments, Julie or Paul, about choosing Cordova Bay? I know there's washrooms at some of the access points. There's some parking, public parking. There's some other facilities and public spaces.
There was also a concern that if we limited to just one access point, which was becoming Parker Park, it was really putting a lot of strain in one particular area. Yeah. So trying to, dissipate some of the visitors, I guess, to a larger area.
Excellent. A few questions here around process, and specifically just a little bit more clarity around this strategy is something that first needs to be presented to council and be received by council. And so maybe we can have a little bit of clarity on next steps and how council will be included in this process.
Please say that again, Patrick.
Yeah, so just thinking
Sorry.
about council's role here, and so
Oh,
I believe we'll be presenting the strategy to council and inviting them to provide some feedback, but just wanting a little bit more clarity on that process and how council is going to be involved in the adoption of this strategy.
yeah, ultimately, this is a decision of council. This will be brought forward, and it's council's decision to accept for information or to adopt or whatever their next steps are. We will be taking feedback from tonight. Some people had some great suggestions like accessibility and making some allowances for folks who have accessibility challenges. We're bringing forward the engagement results from phase 3 and compiling all of this and bringing it forward to council through a presentation.
Excellent.
We determine then.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and council has that discretion, of course, and maybe another comment here on process that kind of fits right in nicely with that answer is, once or if these changes are adopted, is there going to be an opportunity to revisit them after a certain period of time to make changes based off of how we're experiencing the strategy and how it's impacting, the community?
Through the monitoring and evaluation process, that there's better information gathered on how people are using leash optional areas, whether they're being successful or not, whether they're being, continuing to have high level of maintenance, for example, or being well maintained for all park users. And to evaluate, yeah, for sure, if there are issues with certain leash optional areas or there are places that are underserved as the community demographics change or the places the community develops, then there should be for sure opportunities to reevaluate.
Thanks for that. And maybe just a bit of, I'm seeing a couple questions here just around playgrounds and perhaps the relationship between dogs and playgrounds, bit of clarity on how dogs are to be leashed or not leashed on playgrounds.
The rules around playgrounds are not, we did not make any recommendations on changing that. So the bylaw is consistent. Dogs are not allowed within 10 meters, I believe, is the current regulation with leashed. And that stands. And we're hoping that, and there are some parks that may have playgrounds as well as leash optional areas, and there's an opportunity maybe if there does need to be some separation of uses, there may be some fencing or planting that goes in to further emphasize that divide.
Sorry, just to clarify, Megan, dogs must be on leash in our playgrounds. Yeah.
On leash.
Yeah.
Great. Another question here, just a little bit on process and specific to this event. So will the questions be posted tonight with the recorded transcript? And so Drew, I think maybe I'll pass this one on to you. How are we planning on using the recording tonight?
The recording will definitely be posted on the website, and we will have a list of all the questions that we answered live tonight. So if the district is all right with that, then we can post all of the questions that were answered as a bit of a FAQ.
Excellent, thanks for that. So there's a question here specifically again about Cordova Bay, and that the existing restrictions is that at the moment it's leash optional until 9 a.m. Does that mean that this time is going to change if this strategy gets adopted? How will Cordova Bay change essentially if the new strategy is adopted?
It's currently would not have time or season restrictions for the leash optional condition. So leash optional all times of day when the parks are open, and all year.
Thanks for that clarity. A really interesting question here around, you know, the concerns that folks are expressing about off-leash dogs in parks. What is the main concern that we're hearing from the public? You know, what is it that needs to be improved in order to create those spaces that are safer, more inclusive, and just more convivial for all users?
Yeah, it's just important for people to know when they go to a park whether they're going to possibly encounter dogs off leash or not. There are some people who want to avoid parks that have dogs off leash, and as well with the number of dogs growing in the community. There is the concern that all parks will have more and more dogs off leash, and there'll be fewer places for other folks. I think there's lots of opportunities, and I know there were limited opportunities to provide natural areas. It's just the condition of Saanich parks. There's limitations there, but hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Megan. Yeah, I think that does answer it. I'd say, and maybe this is a question for Paul at this point, but really thinking about the two processes between Kings Road's community nature green space strategy and the interaction with this particular strategy. You may have touched on it earlier on. I know there was a question specifically about Kings Road nature green space. So really thinking about how those two processes are going to maybe be concurrent, or how they might be integrated with each other, considering one's going June 5th and one is going to council June 26th.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I think my previous response is worthy of a bit more clarification. So the Kings engagement process up to this point only dealt with establishing visions, goals, and a preferred management model. So the management model really has to do with, you know, as a parks department, we wanted to gauge the level of effort that the community wanted to put into managing that park. There were some community members that, if I recall correctly, that we're talking about Swan Lake at certain points and looking at not-for-profit status and partnering with the municipality, or even taking over management of that park space. That's in the end, that's not what we heard, but really that's what that engagement strategy was about. So in essence, it's still very early days in developing an understanding of what that park will eventually become. So in no way are we jumping the gun with respect to dog management, pet management specific to that park. So at this stage, it's really about understanding vision, goals, and then we'll be getting into specific facilities and more detailed discussions with the community about Kings at a later date.
Thanks for that, Paul. Thinking a little bit about process again here, just looking at how some of the results from the round 2 of engagement helped impact the recommendations. So specifically, the questions we were asking around the different models that the strategy could follow. And so, yeah, how did the results of that engagement round impact the recommendations in the strategy? It seems as though perhaps model 4 is the one that was most reflective of the strategy.
I think we didn't go on either end. So the current Saanich model, I think we heard from too many people through the engagement that the current model was not working well. And then also the restrictive model where only fenced optional or fenced areas would be suitable and no beaches was also too extreme. We found there was quite a lot of either strong support and strong disagreement with those two polar ends. So we aimed for a place in the middle. That's where we found, I guess, the most agreement, the most balance between pet owners and non-pet owners as well. We were looking for that. So we did consider that. We had heard strongly from everybody that the current Saanich model was working. That would have maybe changed where we ended up, but that's not what we heard. It was quite polarizing, I think, where we were coming from. So we tried to meet in the middle there and find a happy medium. So somewhere, I would say somewhere around the urban context model. So the third one, because we are recommending switching the bylaw, and that's mostly for clarity and just to be really clear and improve understanding.
Yeah, so really thinking about all the diversity of input that we've received and trying to find that shared common ground between so much of the commentary that's been provided over the course of this process. I would love to speak a little bit to, I guess, the potential impacts of this change in policy or strategy for off-leash areas, and the idea that if we're limiting off-leash areas to these small parks and small areas within parks, won't this really create quite a bit of pressure on those areas, and how can we manage that pressure, maybe in terms of maintenance and operations, but also just thinking about that.
Well, we are recommending increased maintenance, and part of that will be because maybe those areas might be more intensely used, possible. We're gonna have to kind of wait and see, but there is budget and staff included here to specifically manage and improve and ensure that those areas are get more maintenance, essentially, because they might be more heavily used. Was there another part of that, Patrick, that I missed?
Yeah, just thinking about, are there considerations for, the amount of, I guess, the pressure, the intensity of dog usage that's going to be occurring within those smaller off-leash areas.
I think, there are 57 parks that will have these leash optional areas. I think that's actually quite a high number. If you look at most communities, it's more like an order of magnitude higher. So I'm hoping with that in mind that it does still meet needs. Many of the parks that were excluded from that list are like very small, the little neighborhood parks, or just had conflicting uses that really, I think, wouldn't be well used by people who are exercising their dogs off leash for other reasons anyway. Yeah, this is part of the monitoring and evaluation process as well, though. And Julie, pass it to you.
And just a reminder that dogs will continue to be welcome in the other parks, but dogs will be on leash. So you can still continue to walk in those other parks.
Yeah, great clarifying point there, Julie. And yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Megan, that, the monitoring and implementation phase of this would also look at, what's working well, what's not working well, and certainly wanting to be adaptable to some of those circumstances. So yeah, really key point there. Just a question about fines and whether they would be cumulative and increase if individuals refuse to follow those rules around compliance on leash areas.
That's one of those areas that I think requires a deeper dive and more discussions with CRD, and who is currently on contract with Saanich to enforce bylaws. To whether, what that would look like and how that would be implemented and whether it might be effective. So that's why the recommendation is to explore that as an option.
Yeah, and I think the focus of bylaw compliance is really starting at that education component, right?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. That's always the focus from having conversations with those bylaw officers as well.
Great. Just trying to run through. There are a lot of comments in here as well. So just looking here. So maybe a question again, having a little bit more context here on Mount Doug Park. There's a lot of comments around Pacoles and Mount Doug Park and restricting access to of off-leash dogs to that loop. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can give again a little bit of context to that particular question around why are we limiting to 1.5 kilometers in Mount Doug Park in that trail loop.
I think the whole park is highly valued, and there's a lot of restoration efforts going on throughout the park. So I did see some comments about, you know, it's maybe doesn't have the environmental values that are being purported, but there are lots of restoration efforts going on. And I think Paul spoke to this before as well, that you know, it's an area that we may be able to put fencing and actually still protect the environmental area. It's to fence all the trails in order to protect the ecosystems, or even just to try to keep dogs on the trails is not really realistic from an operational standpoint, just because of some of the terrain, type of trails there are, etc. There's a lot of different factors that went into that decision.
Great, thanks for that, Megan. I'm just noting now that we're at about 7:58 p.m. So just maybe one or two more questions here. There's a question really about banning horses in Pacoles. Has that been considered, or what is the current what is the thinking around horses in this particular park? If there has been any.
I didn't hear anything about people riding horses in that park, positive or negative, that I can recall. Do you recall any comments about that, Patrick or True, from the engagement results, nor from bylaw or staff? So that's why there's no change in that.
And maybe a final one then. Yeah, I don't really recall anything specific, but maybe a final one here. When the strategy was being developed, were we considering the protection of ground nesting birds?
I mean, we didn't have mapping specifically of high use areas, but it certainly can be considered in any of the environmentally sensitive areas or ecological restoration areas, fenced or not fenced, in parks. So you're doing a broader brush, I would say, and not looking at any one species in particular. Was that a question? Maybe it's a question about seasonality in the nesting bird window. Whether there's should be seasonal restrictions as well.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is specifically that there aren't going to be necessarily seasonal restrictions at this point. The strategy isn't looking at that, but yeah, we're thinking that it's covered by the ESAs, the environmentally sensitive areas. Yeah, great. Well, with that, I'll just know we've gotten to 8 p.m. here. We've answered as many as 84 questions, so quite a few. I want to thank the panelists for having spent the time this evening to answer all your questions. I know there's still about 60 left in this in our list here, but we'll do our best to contact you and to also create a bit of a frequently asked question note to post online, so that for those of you who may not have had your answers or your questions answered, you'll be able to see those at a later date on the website. True, please, I'll
Just
pass it
to
on to
add,
you.
thanks, Patrick. Just to add to that, just wanted to note for folks that submitted questions anonymously, we'd really appreciate if you could email your question if it wasn't addressed to parks@saanich.ca, and we will respond directly to that question. And then those questions sent by email will also be recorded and summarized as part of feedback for this phase of engagement. And I think Julie also noted, and Patrick, you'll probably get to this, but the draft strategy is available on the project website right now, along with a feedback form that asks for your feedback on the different recommendations that Megan presented, as well as just overall comments on the strategy itself. So would really encourage you to fill out that feedback form as well.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, True, and I'll pass it on to Julie.
Yeah, just that feedback form will be online until midnight, June 11th. So just so you know, that's a Sunday. So it's fairly quick.
Great. So yeah, we encourage you all to to go online and to answer the questionnaire, so that we can take the results of that and refine the strategy. Make sure as much of your comments and feedback is incorporated into it before we present it to council. So again, we really want to emphasize that we're trying to achieve really a balanced approach here to sharing Saanich Parks. We appreciate your time tonight for coming out to this event. I hope we were able to answer your questions as clearly as possible. And again, feel free to reach out if you feel like you need more questions answered. And so with that, I think we'll call it a night, and good night to all of you. Again, thank you for participating.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your questions and for participating.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.